So, John, Steve, we've all been playing a bunch of Link's Awakening. I think John a little bit more than the rest of us. And given the fact it just came out, I wanted to discuss this game. I think there is a lot to talk about here, just with the improvements and the general feel and just how it compares to the Game Boy version. But before we dive into our discussion here about the game, I just want to give a quick heads up that for most of this discussion, there won't be any major spoilers at all. We're going to avoid talking about the story in depth until the latter half of the review, or of the discussion rather, and then we'll give a heads up as to when that happens. So if you're new to the game, don't worry, you should have a spoiler-free experience until the point where there will very clearly be marked spoilers from that point on. And with that out of the way, let's get to our review discussion. So John, you played the game more than probably most humans on the planet. So let me ask you this real quick. Is this a definitive version of Link's Awakening?
I think it is, yeah. So there are 3 versions of this game now. There's the original, there's a DX version, and then there's a brand new Switch remake. And I played through the DX version right before doing this review, and it kind of highlighted a lot of problems that the original always had. So there's only 2 buttons on the Game Boy, and they didn't necessarily design the world that well around that limitation, so you're opening up that menu and changing your items basically every single screen on the Game Boy. And on the Switch now, because items are kind of always mapped to certain buttons, like your shield's always out, your sword's always out, the Pegasus boots are always out, and the power bracelet's no longer an item anymore, it's just kind of part of your moveset.
Thank God.
So because of that, it's just way easier to get around this world now. And that's the biggest improvement of them all. Just changing that small thing has radically improved my experience with Link's Awakening.
It's really hard to argue, even from a visual standpoint, this is a very beautiful looking game. And like John said, there's tons of quality of life improvements that really make this just a more comfortable playthrough. It wasn't until John was talking about it in his review that I realized when I played through the game eons ago, when it was on the Game Boy, I did have to open that pause menu constantly to equip whatever I needed, and you don't really think about the fact that there used to be Zelda games where Link didn't have his sword and shield all the time. That's huge. So yeah, and aside from that, just presentation-wise, this is the best version of Link's Awakening. You have the stuff from the color version, and you have this gorgeous new visual presentation to enjoy.
It's so beautiful, man. I think this is my favorite looking Switch game right now. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most technically best looking, even though there are some beautiful effects going on. But just art style wise, I think this looks absolutely stunning.
Yeah, it's super gorgeous, and I think probably the best choice it could have gone with in order to stay true to the original game, while also updating it to, look more modern. Between the toy-like characters and the diorama-type environments, it is just a very pleasant visual design to look at, and again works super well for the purpose of updating what was a very kind of rigid, grid-like appearance in the original Game Boy game.
It's a rather literal conversion as well. Like, Link's model is very much based on his sprite rather than the artwork. So like his eyes are little dots, just the shape of his body is very similar to that sprite. And even the trees have a little glimmer on top of them, which might have even inspired like the toy kind of art style, because everything has this like little reflective kind of gleam to it, which is very much in line with how it looked on Game Boy.
And that looks so good. Like I would just sit there in some of the temples and just watch those lava enemies or whatever, and watch as they emit light onto the walls, and
there's like this radiative effect to the lava in this game. And I think it's in like one of the final dungeons that there are these ice blocks, and the glow that they emit, it's so convincing. It's just such a cool glow that they have. And I said earlier, I don't think this is technically the best looking game, but I think there actually are some really impressive technical achievements here. The water looks great, the fire looks great, and as we were just saying, the lava and ice, they look great too. There's just some beautiful materials. Like when you go in a house and you look at the floor, the surface is just so realistic looking. Like, it kind of looks like a diorama at some points.
Especially with how they went for the whole kind of tilt shift look too, with the blur along the bottom of the screen. So I think for me, like, this is a near perfect remake. I don't think it's necessarily a perfect game, but I think when it comes to updating like a classic, especially one that's 25 years old and was on an 8-bit system, this is about as close to perfect as you can get. Like, it's remarkably true to the original, while updating it in almost all the right ways throughout the experience, whether it's the graphics or the controls, how the world design works now.
And not to throw Pokemon Let's Go under the bus, but comparing that remake to this remake, I think this one just seems a lot more ambitious. Because in Pokemon Let's Go, they have the loading points in the exact same places they were on Game Boy. So in order to get to the next screen, you often have to go through these little side passages to get to the next town. and it's the exact same thing on Switch, whereas Link's Awakening is entirely seamless. Now, there were some limitations in achieving that, of course, technical-wise. The frame rate does go down a bit for like a second or two whenever you enter a new area, which is distracting, but I wouldn't say it's game-breaking in any way. I'm always noticing that the frame rate is going down, but it never goes to the point where it's unplayable.
I agree with you to an extent, John. When you're out in the overworld, the frame rate drops are noticeable, but there is one specific part in the world where it gets in the way of gameplay.
Is it the swamp that you're thinking about?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Swamp, the frame rate is really bad, and it's sustained. That kind of took me out of it. Fortunately, it's a spot that you visit for a very short
period. For like 10
of the
seconds.
Game. Yeah. Yeah, but it is an excruciating 10 seconds. And so I do have to call that out. If you haven't seen our technical analysis video, Brainchild did a great job breaking down why that happens, and I'm not even going to try to repeat it here. Mm-hmm. But I do have to say, it is technically an incredibly impressive game, those small performance issues aside.
Yeah, those are really unfortunate. As John was saying, they're not game-breaking, but they are extremely, to me, distracting. Because the frame rate literally cuts in half. And that is extremely noticeable every time it happens. And it happens pretty often. And it sucks because the game is so great otherwise. And it is at 60 most of the time, but when it drops to half, you can't help but notice it. And I really wish I had an option to just lock it at 30. Which is something I don't say too often, but I think in this case, it actually might have helped.
But it's still at least an improvement over what we played before the game came out.
Yeah.
Back at E3, that was a mess.
60 was the exception at E3, whereas now 30 is the
Exactly,
exception.
right. So it is impressive that in those few months, they did manage to make the game a lot more playable. But they didn't quite make it, though. They didn't quite get there.
For sure, and it seems to happen mostly when you're going between areas and it's trying to load the next area. And I think that might partially be a function of how the camera works this time. So moving on, let's discuss probably one of the bigger but subtler changes, and that's the fact that the camera, or maybe I should say the world, works completely differently this time, in that it's completely seamless and the camera's following you as you travel throughout the world. Whereas on the Game Boy, it was built screen by screen, meaning the camera wouldn't move until you pushed into the next area, kind of like how it worked on the original Zelda on NES. And for the most part, I think it works pretty well, and it's probably one of the better solutions they could have gone with. But it does introduce a few kind of odd elements, some for the better and some for the worse. So for one, you can now see parts of the world from within another portion of the world that you wouldn't have originally. And it's kind of cool in a sense, and they can better understand how this world's connected because it's all just one large world now. But it does have a drawback in the sense that I feel like it can chip away at the atmosphere at a couple of points. For instance, when you're in the town, you can now see well into the woods, the mysterious woods, which you couldn't at all on the Game Boy. So it kind of makes it feel a little bit less mysterious when you can see into it from the town. It kind of chips away the atmosphere a little bit because you can also see what's going on in there. Like you can see the enemies trying to target you. And it kind of feels like more of an active game area as opposed to the very tranquil nature of the town that I felt on the Game Boy. Again, it's not a big deal, but it does kind of like adjust the feel of the game at points. Though I think there might have been a middle ground they could have gone with, where the camera has free movement but only within set areas, a little bit like A Link to the Past. So basically, if you're in a town for instance, the camera would follow you around the town, but wouldn't go beyond the town's boundaries, so you can't see into the woods for instance.
Kind of like Mario Maker 2 as well, you can draw a line to stop the camera from scrolling. That could have worked quite well here.
Right.
There's one instance that I'm going to mention in the spoiler portion later, but there's one point where the camera just could have moved. It does kind of ruin part of the scene.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty great one. And by that I mean terrible.
I will say the Rapid Rides minigame is a lot more playable now, because on Game Boy you were never really quite sure where you were going. Like the current would take you in certain directions, but you wouldn't know exactly where the screen's going to go because you can't see what's next. So whether you're going to go left, down, right, that's just guessing work or memorization. Whereas now on Switch you can see exactly where you're going, and it does make it somewhat easier as well. Like if you want to get the heart piece, for instance, you can see exactly where it is. Just get your hook shot out and try and get over there. So in that sense, yeah, it's easier, but it makes a whole lot more sense now. So I do prefer that a lot. But at the same time, I get what Andre's saying. Like sometimes it can kind of break immersion, and I've also found sometimes the camera, the way it shifts, can show things you're not meant to see. Like in the house where the ghost lives, there's this one pot that you break with a seashell. And when you pick up that seashell in the house, the camera tilts, and you can see the black void that's like surrounding the house. You can see out of that void for just a moment, and you're not meant to see that, but it is visible.
Yeah, that'll happen a time or two, but on the whole, I do want to stress, like, it's very obvious a ton of love went into this remake. They did such a fantastic job just updating pretty much every facet of the game, to the point where, remember, the original game was basically built on a grid. And that is still kind of the case here too, seeing as it is basically a one-to-one remake. However, they did such a great job in making it appear less grid-like, making everything feel a little bit more organic and round, and it just looks so great.
Everything's a straight line in this game. Even the walls, they're just straight line. There are no curves. But they have added more geometry to a lot of it, though. So while the straight lines are preserved, the detail makes it feel a bit more lifelike. So I don't think it feels dated, though. There was never really a point where I just sort of looked at the game and said, "This looks like a Game Boy game," because they do their best to make it not feel like a Game Boy game. Yeah. This feels like a modern Switch game.
In fact, one part of the game might be a little bit too detailed, and by that I mean the freaking cracked walls. They blend in so much better now with the environment. It's actually detrimental to seeing them. Especially if they're at the bottom of the screen, because the camera's perspective, it's way harder to see the angle of the wall there. So I was stuck in that freaking tower for like an hour trying to figure out where to go, and it turns out I was just missing or overlooking this one cracked wall over and over and over.
Oh my god, thank you.
Right?
I did the same thing, and I didn't even want to put it in our Discord, because I was like, I don't want the other guys to think I suck at games. So I spent probably the same amount of time just looking for a freaking cracked wall in Eagle Tower, just muttering to myself, like, I'm going to find it and I'm not going to use a guide.
I was talking to someone else too that had the exact same issue. Whereas John didn't, but I wonder if that's because you had just played the Game Boy version a few days before.
That's probably it.
Yeah.
But speaking of that one Eagle Tower moment, though, I actually did struggle with that on the Game Boy as well. So maybe that's just a really, hidden wall or something.
Eagle Tower is Link's Awakening's version of the Water Temple. It's just, it's awful.
It's not that bad, but yeah, there is that one moment with that wall that is kind of troublesome.
Well, speaking of the Water Temple, whenever I think of Water Temple, I think of going to the pause menu and equipping and unequipping the freaking iron boots constantly, which basically is how the entirety of Link's Awakening on Game Boy worked. You're going into the menu constantly, as I touched on earlier, to equip, various items which would replace your sword and shield. The two fundamentals of Zelda games you would replace with other essential items in this game. And I am so glad that's now addressed. We kind of touched on it earlier, but it's worth repeating. The way items work now is just fantastic, where you always have the sword, you always have the shield both equipped, you always have the power bracelet equipped, you always have the Pegasus boots equipped, and then you equip, the other items on top of all that. You're probably only going to the menu maybe a few dozen times throughout the game. You don't need to switch your inventory too often.
Right.
I kept Rock's Feather equipped for most of the game. And
Same.
I think that might have the side effect of making the game a little bit easier. I don't think I died at all in my main playthrough. In fact, I know I didn't because I got the special ending. Whereas I know on the Game Boy, I definitely died quite a bit in the original experience. Plus, this game is made a little bit easier by the new bottles, which you can keep fairies in as well. But overall, I think it's a worthwhile trade-off because I love not having to enter the inventory to switch stuff out constantly. Like, my point with that is, on the Game Boy, I would purposely not equip the ideal items, but I just hated going into the menu constantly. So I would just I would just push through an area with a ton of enemies with no sword equipped and only my power bracelet. But screw it, I don't want to go back into the menu.
And the Pegasus boots were so situational on the Game Boy that you only ever used them to jump over those pits with Rock's Feather or to get through those crystals. Which apparently are jelly now. Who knew?
Yeah, that's a weird thing. We hold on. We can't just gloss over that.
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about the jelly.
No one thought they were jelly. They were crystals.
They never wobble on Game Boy. They never wobble. They're hard.
Nope.
They make like a hard sound when you go through them.
Yeah.
But now
and they shatter. Yeah.
Yeah. What is with that?
I don't know. I don't get it.
You would think that if they were jelly, they could melt with the magic rod. I'm just pointing that out.
Good point.
Anyway, the Pegasus boots. So on the Game Boy, these they weren't even worth using to traverse around with, because every single time the screen scrolls, your animation resets. So if you're running with the Pegasus boots on Game Boy, when the screen scrolls, you have to like rev up again and just start running again. So that was just kind of like, what was the point? It's just quicker just to walk, especially as revving up takes up like half the screen. Whereas now on Switch, because there are no screen transitions, you can just run for as long as you want. And the Pegasus boots are of course also on ZL, so they're not an actual like item that takes up a slot. So they're way more useful this time. I ran so much more than I ever did on Game Boy.
Oh yeah, I mean you can now, which is pretty handy. So yeah, navigating the world, I would say on the whole is just more pleasant this time because you don't have to worry about all the screen transitions. Moving on to other parts of the presentation, we haven't discussed the music yet, which I don't know how that's possible because that is, for the most part, fantastic. Is it Mabe, maybe? How do you say?
I think it's pronounced Mabe.
Mabe?
I used to say Mabe, but then I was called out for it, and apparently in Japanese it said Mabe, so I think that's the actual pronunciation.
Mabe Village's music is just so good. It's like everything I wanted it to be, and I feel like it's hard. I know it's hard to go back to the original now, for that specific song at least. Whereas there are a few other songs in the game that the main melody may not be as pronounced as I may have expected based on the Game Boy. But overall, like, the music is just fantastic across the board. Like, you mentioned in the review how Animal Village now has actual animals singing along to the music.
And in the original Game Boy version, that was an incredibly small loop. Like, it must take 10 seconds and it just repeats and repeats and repeats. So while the animal singing is a bit weird, I do kind of like it more. It just gives it a bit more flavor and makes it a bit less irritating.
I like the Animal Village song. I love the new Totaka song remixes that are in there. Those sound fantastic. And the overworld theme, you know, we haven't really gotten to hear the traditional Legend of Zelda overworld theme in a game in a while. Like, it was just kind of sort of there in Breath of the Wild, but we have like just the traditional presentation of it in Link's Awakening, and I love that.
Did you guys notice the pitch change when you meet up with Marin?
No.
So, okay, alright, so it was super cool. So this pitch change happens only when you have Marin with you. And the overworld it gets a bit higher, a little bit, I guess a bit more romantic almost. But yeah, just for those moments, it must be like a 5-minute section while you have Marin with you. But for that moment, the overworld changes just a tiny bit.
See, I just warped her. I didn't walk, so I was like, okay, let's get you where you need to go. Bye. So yeah, I don't think I really heard it.
That's another great improvement too, is the warp points now and how those work.
Oh hell yeah, yeah. So yeah, in the original, you had Mumbo's song, which was kind of your quick warp, apart from it only took you to Mumbo's pond, which, while helpful because it's like bang straight in the middle of the world, it wasn't always too convenient. And also, when you're warping anywhere, you've got to go in and out of portals repeatedly because there's no menu. So let's say you want to get to Animal Village and you're in Mabe Village. You have to go in and out of that portal until you get there. And there's only like 4 of them in that game. Whereas on Switch, there's 10 portals this time, and you can quick travel to any of them from at any point as long as you either are near a portal or have Mumbo's song. So it's far easier to get around the world this time. Which is, I'm really thankful for, because sometimes this world is a bit tedious to traverse. Like, there are so many boulders, so many pits, and places like Taotao Heights are kind of tedious.
Taotao Heights is especially egregious in how it's basically a labyrinth. And you do unlock like warp points during it, but you don't ever really need them, so they're pointless.
Yeah, none of them are helpful.
Yeah.
Like, there's one right by level 7, one right by level 8. Apart from that, there's one more, which I think is also near level 8, which is weird. But none of them really help you to get to like where the rooster guy is. So it's all just like when you're in the post game looking for seashells and heart pieces, none of those warp points are going to help you.
No, they won't at all. I actively dislike Taotao Heights. Anything involving it. Like, I would look at the map.
Apart from the music.
Okay, alright, I take it back. The music is pretty great. Also, the little chicken hut they have there, the Cuckoo Hut or whatever. I'm cool with that too. But everything else, just navigating it is just not a fun experience.
Yeah, and the worst part is that they get you with the 1-2 punch of both 7 and 8 being there. So you finish 7 and you're like, finally, I'm out of here. And they're like, just kidding. Come on back.
Go all the way to the left.
And good luck figuring out how to get to the turtle. Like, I was looking at the map. I'm like, how in the hell do I get to that temple or that dungeon? I have no idea. And I figured it out eventually, obviously. But it's just, it's just not a very intuitive design. And I think that does apply to some degree to the overworld in general. I did find it to be a bit of a chore to explore. There's like one specific moment where I was trying to get the mermaid statue, and like you have to go up like past a tree. Like you can see exactly where you have to go, but you have to go up around the trees, down. You have to cross over the little river.
It's very weird going from Breath of the Wild, which was the most open game in the series, because in Breath of the Wild you can just climb up that wall and get there, whereas now you've got to go all the way around. I found it is obviously less tedious than it was in Game Boy, because you can see where you're going. You can get there faster, and of course you can walk around as well, so that's all very helpful. It does make the game feel a little bit more modern, but it doesn't alleviate every single issue the original had, though.
And I will say, to give it credit too, the map that you can bring up at any time is super useful. Like, it basically offers you an entire view, a view of the entire world. So you could almost play off that map if you can see like a little tiny link on it or something. So,
well, speaking of Breath of the Wild a moment, though, how did you guys feel going from the most open game in the series, going straight back to just traditional linear Zelda? Like, was that jarring for you guys?
To me, it made it feel refreshing. We've been playing mostly 3D Zelda games for decades now. So these 2D Zeldas that are more traditional to the NES and SNES generation kind of feel almost like the Zelda version of New Super Mario Brothers. Like, we're getting something that's delightfully old school.
Better art style, though.
well, speaking of old school, there are times where Link's Awakening can be a little vague on where to go next, like the between chapter hints, for instance, just kind of just feel slotted in there. But they did make one major improvement over the Game Boy version I wanted to touch on real quick, and that is the puzzles involving those freaking chess pieces.
Oh man,
yeah. I don't think I even realized these were chess pieces in the original Zelda game on Game Boy. They just look like decapitated horse heads. And in that game, you would basically just have to keep throwing them until I think they landed right side up, which would seem to be a completely random process. Whereas now they turn it into an actual puzzle where they move like chess pieces depending on where you throw them. You need to figure out where to throw them and make them land into the appropriate slot in the ground. And I love that. That's so clever.
Yeah, there was no strategy to the original. In my recent playthrough, every single time I found those chess pieces, I just lobbed them around. Sometimes they'd land straight up, sometimes they wouldn't. I had no idea what was the cause of it. Whereas now, it actually is a puzzle. And I like that sometimes you have to kind of position yourself at the right angle. Like, there was one puzzle where you couldn't be above the button, otherwise it would bounce in the wrong direction. So you've got to like stand on the opposite end, which kind of made sense as well. So yeah, it definitely does make it feel a bit more fresh and also a bit more logical. And more of a puzzle, because the older version was not a puzzle, that was just lobbing a chess piece around.
I'm not going to lie, I went into those with the Game Boy mentality, and it took me a while to realize that there was actually something more happening. I just kept throwing them and getting frustrated, and then I realized, oh wait, they move like the same way every time. But it took me a lot of times before I figured that out.
Yeah.
If you get stuck, I feel your pain.
Now, there is one big addition to this game, because for the most part, the game is basically a one-to-one remake beyond the interface changes and the seamless world design now. But they also added an entire new feature called Dompe's Chamber Dungeons, and this is basically a very, very simple dungeon maker, and by that I mean you use existing rooms from dungeons you've already explored in order to create a route through these preset shapes that Dompe gives you in order to create a dungeon that goes from the entrance to the exit, and then you have to actually play through the dungeon yourself in order to finish it off. But for me, I did it once, and I'm like, that wasn't that fun. I don't know why this is here. But John, you played way more of that than I did, so is it?
This part of the game is lengthy. So basically, there are 3 initial waves of Dompe dungeons, and there are 4 different layouts in them. So there's basically 12 to begin with, and then he gives you another 12 after. And we've got a video on this. When you finish those final 12, you do not get any reward. He gives you 300 rupees per dungeon. But finishing all of them gets you nothing. It was just so disheartening, because I put so many hours into that thing, and you get nothing for it. But the actual dungeons themselves, they do sometimes get a bit more involved. So like the final one, Dompe basically challenges you, well, this is one of the final ones, he challenges you to make a dungeon completely out of stairs. So there's like 40 rooms, and every single one of them has to be a staircase. So getting all of your staircase slots to fit together is kind of like a puzzle within itself, and that took a while. But then, when it comes to navigating these chamber dungeons, it can get a bit tedious, especially later on, because the boss key is never in the same place. In fact, the boss key is always in the last chest that you open. So this can take a long time. Like, there was one of these chamber dungeons that had 54 different dungeons in them. So I had to navigate 54 different rooms, find every chest in them, until I find the boss key. And this includes going up and down stairs every single time and going through those sub-areas. So these are very lengthy dungeons. And the thing is, these rooms that you're going through are the exact same rooms that you've already played, so you're very familiar with every puzzle in here. And a lot of these rooms also duplicate boss battles in them, not just mini-bosses, like actual bosses. So sometimes you're fighting multiple bosses that you've already fought within the same dungeon, and there's 24 of these in total, so this is just a very long way of milking Link's Awakening, which is weird for Link's Awakening, because this game is quite brief. This game never milks itself, and then this feature comes along and just repeats everything.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I fell asleep during that discussion. I think this is a bad addition. I'm just gonna lay it out there. This takes away from the game. If you are new to the game and you don't realize this is not an essential part of it, I could see this damaging your experience. Like, it really has no place here. I don't know why Dompe's here. It adds nothing to the game. It can only take away. I think it would have been better had he just cut it entirely. Granted, if you know it's pointless, you can ignore it, but I'm afraid that there's gonna be people out there who don't, and they're gonna be frustrated by a mediocre addition. Like, it's a cool idea, it's just a lackluster implementation.
Can we also touch on why Dampe's here? Like, he is a character he's a recurring Zelda character. He's been in Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Four Swords Adventures, A Link Between Worlds. He's been in a few games. But Link's Awakening's special because there's no other recurring Zelda characters. This is all a fresh cast, and some of them are, like, they have cameos in here. He's not a cameo, he's a Zelda character. I hate that he's here. And it's not like you can ignore him either, because like, after the first dungeon, he's hanging out by that cave where Bow Wow is.
Yeah.
He just, like a big goofy grin on his face, like, Dampe, I don't want to see you. Go back in your cave.
Wow. Harsh, but fair.
Yeah, Dompe's dungeons are a lot like Super Mario Maker for the 3DS. It's the root of a really good idea executed in the worst possible way.
Well, and related to that, it has an incredibly obscure way of sharing levels, too.
Exactly. I'm not going to tap my amiibo and then give it to a friend so they can try my level. We're paying for Nintendo Switch Online. Why can't we share these dungeons we make? But that's a whole other thing, and I do hope somewhere down the line Nintendo makes a Zelda Maker where we can design dungeons. But
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really hope Nintendo doesn't take the wrong lesson from the feedback in regards to Dompe's Chamber dungeons, because I want to make dungeons. I just don't want to do it using preset, pre-built pieces that's part of a kind of a pretty forgettable side quest in an existing game. I want a dedicated game to this idea, and there's so much you can do with it. So I really hope Nintendo doesn't steer away from that now.
right, and going back to John's question, why is Dompe here? He and I had been talking about it, and this should absolutely be Bowser. It should not be Dompe. Bowser would have been so cool to have as the person helping you design dungeons.
It all made so much sense.
Totally.
Yeah, you have Wart there, you have Goombas, why not have Bowser?
You arguably have Mario.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
You
Kind
pass
of
a,
Luigi as well.
yeah, there's a goat catfishing someone with a picture of Princess Peach.
And the thing is Bowser, like, at least for the original games, he kind of went hand in hand with dungeons. Like, you're always fighting Bowser in a
Good
dungeon.
point.
He would have made so much sense to be the dungeon keeper.
Oh,
Exactly.
man. That's such a better idea, but yeah, they really just should just cut it entirely, I think, and focus that budget on improving the performance of the game. All right, guys, anything else about the gameplay you want to bring up, or should we move on to the spoiler portion of the discussion?
I think we've already been inching our way into the spoiler
I think we have,
portion.
Yeah, a little bit.
All right, let's do it. So from this point on, prepare for spoilers. We're gonna blow it all out here. So if you don't want to hear about them, there are gonna be some major spoilers here. Tune out now because we're gonna get into it. All right, guys. So let me be real with you. I enjoyed playing through Link's Awakening. However, I did not love it for most of it. I thought it was good. I thought, I enjoyed it. But I thought also, I do think even having on Switch, for as much as I love what they did to the game, it also kind of exposed to some of the maybe original game shortcomings, like such as in terms of the world designs we've already mentioned. And yeah, like I thought it was a perfectly fine top-down Zelda, and that was about it. Except there is one thing this game does that it might do better than almost any other Zelda, perhaps better than any other Zelda, and that is the story for me. The setting, the story, the characters. And when I reached the end, it touched me in a way that I know it didn't before. I don't know if I've changed or if it was the way they presented it now. I'm pretty sure it was just more at the point I am at in my life now. I broke down. I'm like, damn, this story is hitting me deep here. And it elevated the entire experience. It made the entire game for me completely worthwhile playing through. Where to the point where I think had it not been for the end, John, I would have probably given it a like had I been reviewing it. But the way the story wraps up and ties everything together, I think would have brought it up to a like a lot for me, because I just loved that story, and it really is like the bow on on the entire package here.
I've been thinking about this, so let's just get the biggest spoiler out of the way first. This game is a dream. This is a dream game. which I think was on the back of the box in the originals. I'm not sure why it's treated like a giant spoiler.
The title is The Island of Dreams in Japan, so it's, there's a spoiler right in the title.
Right.
But anyway, Phantom Hourglass has a lot of parallels with this game. Both of them are dreams. Both of them end basically the same way with the Dream Island, with like Link waking up and retaining elements of the dream. But Phantom Hourglass's story is just so dull and left no impact on me. So why do you think that is? Why do you think this game left an impact while having pretty much the same premise, but Phantom Hourglass was so forgettable?
Well, and also on the to expand that point, it was all a dream. It's one of the most cliche things you can do, right? Like that's happened in movies and countless forms of media, and oftentimes it feels like nothing mattered. It feels like, well, why did I experience a story if it was all a dream and nothing actually took place?
I think I might have an answer to this actually.
Yeah, go for it.
So the game reveals to you pretty early on that this place is a dream. When you defeat the Amos Knight, you find that picture in there with the windfish on, and it basically tells you that the island of Koholland isn't real. And towards the end, bosses are telling you it's not real, and they're kind of making you feel guilty for killing them, because they'll say things like, "Oh, the entire island's going to vanish, and you're going to vanish too." So like you are always kind of like it doesn't come as a surprise that this place is a dream. You're fully aware of what you're doing, which kind of makes the whole process of ending it all feel way more impactful.
Right, because it seems like even though this is a dream, the characters are aware of that fact. Like they are or they may or may not be, but they seem to be like entities that exist for the duration of this dream. And some of them of which are aware of their temporary existence, which is why like the nightmares are like so disturbing in that like they're almost pleading to you at points. Like I think like one of them calls you a fool. He's like, "You are a fool. You're gonna ruin everything here," and that's what partially makes the ending so bittersweet, I guess. I'm still not fully sure how I should feel about it. Because, yeah, Link needed to escape. He needed to wake the Windfish to get out of this dream so he can resume his own life. But in doing so, he ruined everyone else's, effectively. He killed an entire island.
Yeah, so it is really, I like to liken it to Metal Gear Solid 4's microwave hallway, where you're doing something you have to do to push the narrative forward, but there are definitely times where you don't want to be doing it. Link's Awakening does a great job of making you feel attached to the people of Koholland. They get you close to Marin and Terran and other people. You help them. You help all these people that don't really exist. And you slowly begin to realize that if you complete this adventure, you are going to kill them all. You're going to destroy the island, and all these people on it are going to cease to exist. And during the ending, in what I can only describe as super messed up, they show everybody vanishing. They're like, "You did it! Everyone's dead."
Can I mention something that bugs me though in the Switch version? So I kind of teased about this earlier with the camera angles. So basically, everyone's vanishing. Bow Wow vanishes, Bow Wow, and then it goes down to those kids playing catch. But if you look up at the top of the screen, Bow Wow's still there. Like, he's just sort of bouncing around in the corner. So if they just zoomed the camera in a tiny bit so you couldn't see Bow Wow, it'd be fine. But I just like, you see this guy disappear and he's fine. Like, you can see him right over there. That bit bugged me.
Maybe Bow Wow deserved to die twice.
Maybe.
Yeah. Did you see all the people he callously ate?
Yeah.
Yeah, these other dream creatures, man. I mean, it's funny. Like the ending is kind of similar to A Link to the Past in that like it revisits the characters you've seen, but it's the exact opposite. In A Link to the Past, like everyone's celebrating for being returned to their like normal form. You know, like they're no longer these transformed creatures in the dark world. They're back to being who they are or who they were. Here, they are disappearing. Like it's disturbing. They're gone. Especially because if you don't get the special ending, and the only way to get the special ending is by beating the entire game without dying once, something that again is really hard to do on the original game. It's much easier now on the Switch version. But as far as you know, everyone's gone. Even Marin is gone. Because what happens is Link wakes up, he sees a windfish above, so he wakes up in the ocean. He's still out at sea. He looks up and he sees like the windfish flying above, so apparently the windfish was a real entity, unless he's imagining that too or something. And then that's it. Like you go to the credits, it's a really happy theme, and then that's it. You don't hear from anyone else. However, if you get the special ending, you then see a picture of Marin appear on the screen as her song plays, and then you see a seagull like dive into the camera view and like kind of like fly off into the distance. And that, of course, is a reference to the fact that Marin, earlier in the game, said to you like while you were sitting on the beach together. She's like, my dream is to be like a seagull and like fly around. Now I'm gonna start crying talking about this.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Yeah, and like fly around, like sing my song to people all around the world.
Yeah. What I think is impressive as well is we've basically described the major story beats of this game. Like this game, it doesn't have a hugely in-depth story. For the most part, you're going from dungeon to dungeon without any story guidance.
It's very simple.
There's just there's just a few moments where it just stops and gets heavy with you, and those few moments resonate so much. And it might be because the game's quite compact. Like there's only one major town. Marbe Village is pretty much the only real village. And the NPCs there are more or less the only ones you see in the game, so you get very attached to all of them, because you're basically spending the entire game with them. But yeah, when it gets heavy, yeah. And it's so impactful.
Yeah, and something that didn't really dawn on me until I played the Switch version, and it's obviously just a theory, I think that Link is asleep for this entire game. And I think what makes me believe that is that we see him, in this anime art style in the intro, then the entire game takes place, he's, this small, squat, toy-like person, and then, we bookend that with the ending where we're back to a more realistic setting where he's waking up too. So part of me wonders if maybe he isn't asleep through the entire story of Link's Awakening and he's just in the Windfish's dream in his own manifestation, and he is not only fighting to wake the Windfish up, but himself as well.
That makes me like this art style even more, because honestly, people say they'd rather have the entire game in the anime art style. No, I mean, for what you just said, I think it makes way more sense to have this sort of... I mean, the way I'll describe this art style is dreamlike. It looks like a dream. And having that kind of phasey depth of field effect at the bottom kind of sells that as well. So yeah, totally, I think you're right there, Steve.
Is that almost a spoiler, though, then? Because the art style for the game is so dramatically different from the opening cutscene. It's pretty clearly not the real world.
I think you'd have to be a fool to think that this isn't the... Because right at the beginning, there's an NPC that says to you, hey, I'm going to be lost later. Like, this game is clearly weird. They're already true. Self-aware. You gotta know something's going on.
But that's that comes a little bit after, like, you wash up on a beach, right? So in the original game, especially in the original game, it could be assumed that's a natural conclusion or natural following to your shipwreck. Whereas I feel like in the Switch version, it's made a little bit more explicit that something's a little bit off here. Whereas it's not, until a little bit later that you start finding out the true nature of the island. So I wonder if the art style does kind of give that away or tip its hand a little bit early.
I could see that. For me, it didn't click, though, until I saw the ending. And that's when I started having this idea that maybe Link himself was dreaming, that he had been knocked out in that storm and was floating at sea just, as part of the Windfish's dream. But, there's nothing in the game that explicitly points that out. But I do agree that the art style is kind of a tip to that. And it's something that when you played this game on the Game Boy, that art style seemed completely normal because that's just how games looked back
That's
then.
all they could do.
That was the most realism games could muster. So now, that we have a lot more artistic license, we can see that, this is something very different from what the real world looks like for Link.
So I've been trying to dissect how exactly this ending / world works. So is Link dreaming along with a Windfish? Is this some Inception stuff going on here where they're sharing the same dream? So Link is just out of sea during the entire time, or is he transported to inside the dream as an entity? How's this work?
Well, it's the Windfish's dream. But what about when Link goes to bed in the dream? Because there's a point where you get the ocarina and you have to go in that bed and go to another dream place.
It is like Inception. How many layers are there to this?
But we've all had dreams where we're asleep in the dream too. So, or have we all?
I have.
Am I revealing something about myself right now?
Is this a dream? Are we in Steve's dream right now?
We are.
Dear God.
When we wake up, everybody dies. Just
what is a Windfish? What is he? He's like this giant flying whale that, as he says himself, a Windfish only in name. Is he a god? What's his deal?
Here's another point too. Right at the end of the game, you fight Ganon. That's Link's dream. Link's having a nightmare there.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're right.
And what's the other name? The Link to the Past guy, Aghanim?
Aghanim?
Yeah.
Oh, and also and what was the worm called?
Moldorm.
Moldorm. Yeah, you fight him too because he's obviously the scariest boss ever.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, his nightmares keep escalating.
Yeah.
Although Dompe is not a boss, so clearly they didn't get too deep.
That would be fantastic. If they had like one little phase where Dompe in his ghost form just comes out.
And you have to kill him with the hook shot.
Oh, I wish.
Yes.
I wish the ending, instead of showing all the various characters like disappearing on the island, it just focused on Dompe and just showed his painful
Just
death.
his shack disappears.
Oh man, that'd be great. That's
He's the only one that doesn't disappear, and he just slowly drowns.
Oh, he
But-
deserves it.
Yeah, I was like, I was really surprised, like just how touching I found this game, and I think I would have found it to be equally as touching on the Game Boy too had I been replaying that version instead of this one. And it's, as you were kind of saying earlier, John, like this isn't an especially long game. There isn't a ton of story here. Like it's all kind of, a lot of it's contextual, or you come across it in little tiny chunks throughout the game. But it's it's like the old saying, brevity the soul of wit. And this game is so clever with the small amounts of dialogue it does have. Like in looking back, I think the sequence in which Marion is following you around is so ingenious in how it kind of builds a connection with her. Both in when you go to the beach, of course, that's just a very touching cutscene. But also like when she's following you around and like she's commenting on things as you do things. Like I guess your experience may differ depending on how you go about the world. If you take your time with her though, she'll comment on all kinds of things you do, and you can experience unique situations that are impossible to do otherwise. Like if you go to the crane game, you can capture the crane game operator himself. And there's all kinds of cute little things like that she'll kind of comment on, and it does like build up this relationship to the point where she says something like, I hope you never forget me, like I'll never forgive you. And it ultimately builds up to the climax at the end, which again, there's one thing I wonder, and that is, should the special ending be a special ending? I feel like it's kind of essential, and I think it should just be there.
Kind of, yeah. I agree with you. I also think it's clever how the music works in the story as well. Like you think of Ballad of the Windfish, that constantly makes you think of Marin. And even though Marin doesn't really appear that often in the game, there's only a couple of points. Whenever you play that song, it just kind of brings back this rush of memories. Mm-hmm. And the music in this remake just kind of doubles down on every moment. So those heavier moments that were already heavy in the Game Boy, they hit just that harder. Like right at the end of the game, when the Windfish dives over you, and you have that giant orchestral score of Ballad of the Windfish,
Yeah.
like it brings back the entire adventure to you in just those couple of moments. The soundtrack just really sells the game this time.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say, Andre was talking about things that Link's Awakening does better than any other Zelda game. It absolutely does endings better than any other game in the series by a mile. Like it is a very emotional scene. And Zelda games don't usually evoke strong emotional reactions from me, because even though they're becoming more narrative driven, they're still pretty light on, and they're not very intense things. So this was kind of, if I had to liken this to another Nintendo franchise that kind of hit me right in the feels, this is almost on the level of Mario Odyssey's New Donk City celebration for me.
I thought you were going to say Mario Galaxy's ending for a moment, because that was kind of bittersweet as well.
That's true.
It was, but, and maybe it's just because I was older when I played Odyssey than I was when I played Galaxy. I don't know, like Odyssey choked me up a little bit, where I don't have any such memories with Galaxy.
Hold on, did you not read the storybook all the way through in Galaxy?
No, I did, and it's super messed up, but I was a super messed up person back then, so, I'm like, cool, okay, bad stuff happened, let's go get that wing cap, Mario.
I also feel like because the game is so short, that's kind of why it achieves that as well, because everything is still fresh in your memory.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If this were a long game, let's compare it to Breath of the Wild a moment. Breath of the Wild's designed to just continuously be played and played and played. So if they ended it with Hyrule being destroyed, that wouldn't really make any sense, because you're meant to go straight back there again.
Right.
So Breath of the Wild, I think the way it ended was like Zelda smiled at you weirdly and said, "Thank you, Link," and then the credits roll. That was my British impression there. But like Link's Awakening, it can have that impact, just because both one, it's short, and two, I don't think it's meant to be replayed in the same sense as Breath of the Wild is, so it can radically change the world like that.
Yeah, I mean, let's compare it also to a game with maybe a similar setup. I say that kind of loosely, but like Twilight Princess. Like Twilight Princess has like this 3-hour opening where you're going through a town, you're doing all kinds of tasks for the townsfolk, and then the game doesn't really circle back to those themes at all that I remember, or those characters much at all. Whereas like Link's Awakening, you do have that early interaction with the townsfolk too, but it's done on a much smaller scale or a smaller time frame. And it's so much more impactful for it, because those do carry through to the end experience, and again, it circles back to them in a way that Twilight Princess never does. So it makes the opening moments of the game meaningful, whereas Twilight Princesses were just forgettable, aside from the fact it took forever, which I'll never forget.
Honestly, I think the ending, just the entire ending sequence, I think is almost the sole reason this game is considered some people's favorite game.
I think so.
Because it leaves an impact on you. Even if you haven't played this game in decades, you still remember it. It leaves such an impression on you. So I think a lot of people have probably forgotten how tedious Link's Awakening can be, the original Game Boy game. There's so many slow moments. You've got to open menus and got to pick up boulders and things like that. That kind of stuff I think you forget, but you never forget that ending. And revisiting it on Switch, all of the impact is there. None of it's lost. If anything, they accentuate every moment with the music. And that credits music as well. That is phenomenal. There's one point towards the end where it just kind of fades out a little bit and goes into the chiptune Game Boy music for a moment, and then comes back with a giant orchestral piece. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I think the whole ending's beautiful. Like I said earlier, it really elevates the entire experience. The core gameplay is solid, but otherwise it's kind of unremarkable by Zelda standards. It's fine, it's good even, but it's really the ending and the story as a whole that really just takes Link's Awakening to the next level.
Yeah, this is a game you have to play before you die. It's not necessarily the best game. There are Zelda games better than it, but as you say, it's essential.
Yeah.
I have to issue one small correction. This is a game you have to play before Link wakes up the windfish and you die.
Would you guys ever want to see a proper sequel to this game? Say along the lines of A Link Between Worlds, where it takes place in a similar idea, like a dream world, maybe on the same island even. Would you want to see Zelda revisit either this world or these themes?
No, I wouldn't. I think this kind of thing would feel less impactful if you try and do it again. I think they nailed it the first time. I think I'd rather they not.
I'm actually with John on this one. I think that it loses some of its magic if you try to do it again. And I don't think that there is any way that you can do a game with this type of theme and do it better. And clearly, Phantom Hourglass is proof of that because they tried.
Well, speaking of sequels, there were basically 2 more Game Boy sequels in the forms of Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Would you guys want to see those similarly updated on Nintendo Switch?
They could just reuse a bunch of assets from Link's Awakening, but I'm not entirely sure if this art style would work for the Oracle games. So I know it looks like that on Game Boy, but as Steve was saying earlier, this art style's kind of like that because of the Dream aesthetic.
Right. I don't think we see another Zelda game that uses this exact aesthetic. I think we see something a lot more akin to A Link Between Worlds, where it's still got the same kind of, cute short sprites, or cute short models, I should say, albeit with a more, I don't want to say realistic tint, but that's all I can really think to say about it.
I've got a pitch.
Okay.
Instead of connecting Oracle of Ages and Seasons together using some kind of passcode, you instead scan your compatible Zelda series amiibo.
Genius. Brilliant.
It would be cool though if they do re-release Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. It'd be cool if they finished the original concept to have a third game in there too.
Wasn't the third game a remake of the first Zelda though, or something? I thought.
I'm not sure.
I don't know. That would be cool, depending on what that concept was. I don't know if I'm right or not on that. So, all right, guys. Do you have any final thoughts all about Link's Awakening you want to get out there that either we haven't touched on yet or that you would like to elaborate on?
One little thing. So one thing that's been going around a lot about this game is the price value of, is this game worth $60? And we've been saying over the course of this discussion that it's a game you must play before you die. It's very impactful. And for me, I can't see how that can be interpreted as don't buy it. I guess people perceive value and price as different things. Like some people pay more for a certain game, other people will pay less for a certain game. But for me, I think this is just a game that you need to play. If you're at all interested, I think this is something you need to try.
For me, Link's Awakening boils down to a couple of different factors. If you're the type of person who buys a game for number of hours played, Link's Awakening probably isn't worth the $60 investment. If you're someone who plays games for mechanics, story, you're probably going to come away with something worth looking at if you haven't already played Link's Awakening. And finally, if you're the type of person who's into technical showcases and graphics, Link's Awakening is one of the best looking games on the Switch. It's definitely worth your money at the $60 price point if you're into the technical aspect of it. Because if I saw Link's Awakening running on a PS4 or Xbox, frame rate issues aside, I would not think that this was a game that didn't belong there.
I'd pay $60 for the soundtrack. That alone.
Wow, yeah, that one had me speechless for a second. It's a great soundtrack, but I don't know that I'd pay $60 for any soundtrack.
Especially when it's all on YouTube.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, for now, until the Nintendo ninjas get everyone.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So I think we're about done here, right, guys? Anything else, or is that it?
That's
Why
it.
does Link have a Hylian shield in this game?
That's a good question.
Is Marin actually legitimately a seagull now? Is that canon?
Maybe she's in Breath of the Wild. You can just see her in the distance somewhere.
Is Link in love with a seagull?
Oh man, I'm sure there's a fan fiction out there to answer that.
On that note,
He's been out to sea for too long.
That's our cue to wrap it up here. So thank you guys for watching. If you liked our discussion, make sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at GameXplain. You can find links to all those in the description below. And of course, stay tuned to GameXplain for even more Link's Awakening, I'm sure, and everything else Nintendo Switch as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.